Retired K9 uncovers a hidden door in hospital ward. The truth inside shook the entire town. A retired K9 barked at a storage cabinet. Everyone thought he was just restless. But when the nurse moved it, they found a hidden door behind the cabinet, sealed shut for over 40 years. What was on the other side? Old files, forgotten tapes, and a truth that someone risked everything to hide. The autumn air in Belmere, Vermont had turned sharp by early October. A light drizzle clung to the cracked sidewalks and mist threaded between the skeletal trees lining the old main road. At the edge of the town's historic district stood St. Elora Rehabilitation Hospital, a pale-bricked structure with ivy curling along its walls and windows that had long forgotten sunlight. Though now marketed as a center for long-term psychological recovery and elderly care, whispers still called it what it used to be, the place where the government watched minds unravel. Inside, the tiled floors echoed faintly with every step. But that morning, the stillness was broken by a single, insistent bark. Max, a retired German shepherd, stood stiffly in the middle of room 3B, a rarely used supply storage on the third floor. At 9 years old, Max had the bearing of an old soldier. His back legs moved slower than they used to. The silver frosting along his muzzle betrayed years of service, but his amber eyes were sharp, always calculating. He had once served in urban SR, trained to locate survivors under rubble and confined spaces. Now he was part of a therapy dog pilot program. His days were supposed to be filled with gentle pats, slow walks, and the occasional trick for a biscuit. But not today. He stood rigid before a tall oak cabinet, its once-polished surface dulled by time and scuff marks. His growl was low at first, a vibration more than a sound, then grew into a sharp, desperate bark that made the fluorescent lights overhead flicker slightly with its force. Grace Lyman, the 28-year-old nurse in training assigned to the third floor, looked up from the cart she was pushing. Petite, but with strong shoulders from years of lifting patients, she had a quiet resilience, the kind forged not from trauma, but from endurance. Her auburn hair was tied in a messy bun, a few strands glued to her forehead by the humidity of the day. Grace had only recently returned to Belmere after living in Boston for most of her life. She didn't talk much about her childhood, only that she had been adopted young and preferred order and silence. Her patients trusted her, because she listened more than she spoke. She approached Max cautiously. "What's going on, big guy?" she asked, kneeling beside him. He didn't look at her. His ears were forward, gaze fixed on the middle section of the cabinet. The door creaked open behind her and Hal Bennett stepped in, leaning slightly on his cane. In his late 60s, Hal was one of the hospital's oldest staffers, officially listed as a consulting psychiatrist, though in practice he did little more than read old files and offer guidance to the newer therapists. He was tall, rail-thin, with a weathered face and thick glasses that often slid down his nose. His voice always carried a tinge of amusement, like someone who'd seen too much to ever be surprised again. "Did the old boy find a cockroach or a ghost?" he said with a dry chuckle, then paused as he saw Max's posture. His smile faded. "He's not barking at nothing," Grace said. "He's locked on that cabinet. He hasn't moved." Hal frowned, walking closer. "That's been there for decades. Used to keep linen in it, back when this floor was the children's ward." Grace stood and tugged at one side of the cabinet. It didn't budge. She motioned toward the back. "Do you see the baseboard?" she asked. "There's a 2-inch gap. It's not flush against the wall." Hal moved closer, peering over his glasses. Could just be a warped floor. But Max barked again, twice this time, and pawed the floor with urgency. Grace looked at Hal. "Can you help me pull it?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Let's see what the mutt thinks he's found." Together, they pushed. The cabinet protested at first, but then gave way with a screech of wood on tile. Dust billowed from beneath as it slid 3 feet from the wall, revealing something neither expected. A rectangular outline, rust-stained edges. A steel panel bolted directly into the wall. At the bottom right corner, barely visible, was a small, circular metal handle. "What the hell?" Hal muttered. Max sat now, tail sweeping lightly across the floor, his expression calm, as if his job here was done. Grace reached forward and touched the handle. It was cold, much colder than the room's ambient air, and the paint around it had bubbled outward, like heat had once radiated from the seam. Hal cleared his throat. "Don't touch that again, not until maintenance checks it. Could be old electrical wiring or worse." Grace stood. Her voice was steady. "This wasn't in the blueprints I reviewed last week. This wall shouldn't exist." Before Hal could respond, a low voice came from the hallway. "Eleanor." They turned to see Marvin Ellsworth, a 75-year-old dementia patient in a faded blue robe, standing barefoot just beyond the door. Thin and hunched, Marvin's gray hair clung to his scalp like forgotten spiderwebs. He was mostly nonverbal these days, often unresponsive. But now he stared directly at the wall, his eyes wide. "I told her," he whispered. "Don't go behind the cabinet. It listens." Hal stepped forward. "Marvin, come on, let's get you back to your room." But Marvin didn't move. He was shaking now, eyes locked on Max. "It's the same dog," he murmured, "the same eyes, just older now." Grace froze. "What did you say?" Marvin's mouth quivered. Then he turned and slowly shuffled away down the corridor, muttering, "Not again, not again." Hal exhaled deeply. "I don't like this." Grace watched Max, who now lay down in front of the hidden door, resting his head between his paws, tail motionless. She wasn't sure if she should be scared, or if this dog had just uncovered something no human had dared to see for decades. Outside, the drizzle had turned into rain, and though no thunder sounded, something inside the walls of St. Elora had already broken open. The rain hadn't stopped. It danced rhythmically on the old windows of St. Elora Hospital, streaking the panes with rivulets of water that blurred the gray landscape outside. Inside room 3B, the cabinet still sat pushed aside, revealing the cold steel plate, now quietly covered by a sheet Hal had thrown over it earlier that morning. Grace Lyman sat cross-legged on the floor in the hospital library, a place rarely used by anyone other than Hal or visiting med students. Dust drifted lazily in the still air, and the fluorescent bulbs hummed faintly overhead. She stared at 2 floor plans laid out side by side. The first was from 2020, the most recent architectural diagram showing 3 floors labeled rooms, standard hallways. The second, yellowed with age and water-damaged, was dated 1974. She had found it in the basement archive room tucked beneath boxes of expired surgical masks and broken thermometers. On the 1974 blueprint, there was an extra rectangular space outlined in red on the 3rd floor, right where room 3B now existed. But the outline was marked with only a letter M, and beside it, written in tiny typed font, were the words, "Restricted Observation Unit, Lyra Wing." Grace ran her fingers over the label, her stomach tightening. It wasn't just a wall. Someone had built that room on purpose and then erased it from every official record. Still haunted by ghosts and blueprints. Hal's voice broke the silence behind her. She turned. Hal Bennett leaned on his cane at the doorway, the smell of coffee trailing behind him. He was dressed as always in pressed slacks, a faded green sweater, and his hospital badge clipped to his belt like an afterthought. Despite the late hour, he looked oddly alert. "I didn't imagine it," she said, tapping the red box. "This room existed. They hid it." Hal exhaled slowly and walked to a chair across from her, lowering himself with the stiff movement of someone who used to run and had long since accepted walking. "You want the story?" he asked. Grace nodded. Hal stared at the blueprints for a long moment before speaking. "It was 1978 when I first walked through those doors," he began. fresh from med school. Bright-eyed, clean-shaven, naive as hell. They told me I'd be working with trauma cases. Children mostly. But by my second month, I was assigned to the third floor, what they called the observation wing. What kind of observation? Grace asked. The kind no one ever wants to talk about, Hal replied, voice low. Neuro-emotional tracking memory response to stimuli behavior under confined pressure. And it wasn't therapy. It was documentation. Every day. Every hour. Children who had been orphaned, institutionalized, or, like one girl I remember, dropped off by military families with only a name and a sealed envelope. Grace stiffened, and they called it LIRO. Hal nodded. A research initiative supposedly tied to Cold War-era defense psychology. Most of us thought it was shut down when the funding disappeared in '83. But I think he paused, choosing his words. I think it just went underground. Grace turned back to the blueprint. This door Max found. It leads to one of those rooms. It leads to something, Hal replied, rubbing his temple. But I never saw steel doors like that. My wing had curtains, cheap tiles, cameras hidden behind mirrors. That thing, that's not for observation. That's for locking something in or someone out. Before Grace could speak again, the door creaked open and Nina Dobbs, the hospital's administrative officer, walked in. A plump woman in her early 50s, Nina had short-cropped silver hair and sharp eyes behind thick purple glasses. She dressed like someone who had never stopped working in offices since the '90s, shoulder pads, brooches, and perfectly matched earrings. Her tone was always brisk even when she smiled. I heard someone was raiding our archives, Nina said. And here I find our newest nurse and our oldest shrink. How poetic. Grace looked up. I was reviewing historical diagrams. Something doesn't match. Nina crossed her arms. You know we're undergoing renovation planning. If there's a discrepancy, submit a facilities ticket. This isn't about plumbing, Grace said, standing. Room 3B has a hidden space behind the cabinet. Max found it yesterday. There's a sealed steel door. I checked the modern schematics. Nothing is there. But this, she held up the older blueprint, shows a room. A restricted one. Nina's smile faded slightly. That floor has had updates. Multiple walls knocked out over the decades. Probably old storage. There's a metal handle embedded into the wall, Grace pressed. This wasn't drywall. This was built to last. Nina hesitated. Her jaw tightened. Grace, I understand your concern, but please remember this is a hospital, not a treasure hunt. There are protocols. No one opens anything without legal oversight. Grace narrowed her eyes. Did you know about this? I know we don't have time to chase ghosts. Focus on your patients, Nina said, then turned to leave. And tell the dog to stay out of supply rooms. As the door closed behind her, Hal shook his head. Nina's been here a long time, longer than me. If she doesn't want that door opened, it's because she's scared of what's behind it. Grace folded the blueprints and tucked them into her bag. Then I want to know exactly what she's afraid of. As she left the library, Max trotted silently at her side, ears perked, eyes calm. But something in the way he moved, guarded, deliberate, told Grace that whatever secrets lay behind that door, Max wasn't done barking yet. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped but left the sky a dull bleached gray, as if the entire town of Belmere had been tucked under a wet woolen blanket. Inside St. Elora, the corridors remained sterile and cold, yet there was a certain pulse beneath the quiet now, like the building itself was holding its breath. Grace Lyman walked briskly toward room 3B, clipboard in one hand, Max trotting silently at her side. His gait had changed since yesterday, still strong, but his steps seemed more deliberate, like he was moving towards something inevitable. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about the blueprint from 1974, about the Lyrae wing label, about Marvin whispering it listens. And most of all, she couldn't stop thinking about the door. When she stepped into room 3B again, the cabinet was exactly where she had left it the day before, its sides slightly smeared with dust, the thin white sheet Hal had thrown over the steel plate still tucked behind. But Max's posture changed immediately. He froze mid-step, ears up, eyes locked on the cabinet's frame. Then, as if a switch had flipped inside him, he lunged. "Max!" Grace called, but it was too late. He was pawing at the base of the cabinet, claws scraping wood, then pressing his shoulder into the edge, pushing against it with his weight. He let out a frustrated growl, his breath hot and fast. Grace rushed forward, trying to pull him back, but he kept going. His front paws digging now into the tile, trying to wedge his snout between the cabinet and the wall. All right," she muttered, standing and wiping her palms on her scrubs. She turned and ran down the hallway. Less than 10 minutes later, Hal Bennett arrived, holding a crowbar in one hand and a small red toolbox in the other. His sweater was soaked from the drizzle, and his expression had shifted from amusement to concern. "He's not letting it go," Grace said breathlessly. "He's been pawing at it for 20 minutes. I had to leash him to the cart just to keep him from tearing the damn wall down." Hal glanced at Max, who was now lying down with his front legs stretched toward the cabinet, eyes unmoving. "Well," he grunted, setting the toolbox down. "Let's give the old mutt what he wants." Together they pressed their shoulders to the cabinet. It screeched in protest, heavier than either of them remembered. With a final grunt, it slid back nearly a foot farther than before, revealing the full width of the steel panel. This time they saw what had been partially hidden, a thin seam running vertically down the middle, and the weld marks near the top and bottom messy and rushed as if someone had sealed the door in a panic. The bottom corner was different. There the metal had oxidized into deep patches of red and brown. The steel looked almost flaked apart in some areas. Max stood suddenly. He stepped forward, sniffed, then, without hesitation, bit into the rusted section. The metal groaned as he pulled, and a chunk came free, falling to the tile floor with a heavy clang. The sound echoed through the hallway, a dissonant chime that seemed to shake the very walls. Behind the torn panel, a narrow opening gaped in the darkness. Cold air poured out from it, carrying the scent of mold-aged paper, and something older, something sour and metallic. Max didn't move. He just stared. Grace shined her phone's flashlight into the hole. The beam cut through dust motes, revealing a small corridor barely wide enough for one person. Wires dangled from the ceiling, and the walls were stained with years of condensation and neglect. At the far end, a broken fluorescent tube hung by one side, flickering weakly. "Jesus," Hal breathed. "We need to see what's inside," Grace said. "I'm not crawling in there," Hal muttered. "I've got a metal hip, and that space looks like it hasn't seen light since Carter was president." "I'll go," Grace replied, already lowering herself into the passage. Max followed instantly, tail down, body low, like a soldier entering hostile territory. The air inside was cold and wet, clinging to her clothes like fog. The floor creaked beneath her boots as she stepped forward, and her light bounced off filing cabinets, a coat rack, and what appeared to be an old cot, its mattress covered in mildewed sheets. And then, in the far corner, she saw it, a small wooden desk, partially collapsed, with a stack of folders and a tarnished music box resting on top. She reached for the box and gently turned the tiny crank. It resisted at first, then clicked. A soft, broken melody filled the room, 2 bars of a lullaby, halting and off-key, but still strangely familiar. Then the box stopped clicking once more before falling silent. Grace opened it. Inside was a folded scrap of parchment paper, worn so thin it nearly dissolved between her fingers. Written in shaky pencil strokes were 5 words. It wasn't a dream. MG. She felt her breath catch. Behind her, Max whined softly. She turned to find him staring at the far wall. There, barely visible behind a sheet of torn plastic, was a child's handprint in faded blue paint. The narrow corridor behind the steel door seemed to stretch farther than Grace had anticipated. The air grew colder as she walked, and the concrete underfoot creaked occasionally, echoing in the stillness. Max stayed close at her side, ears swiveling, his amber eyes alert and scanning. It felt less like a forgotten storeroom, and more like a crypt, one not meant to be found. The room at the end opened into a chamber no larger than a typical patient suite, but its walls were lined with shelving and rusted filing cabinets. Mold climbed the corners like a fungus veil, and water stains marred the ceiling tiles. The ceiling fan above had long since stopped spinning, its blades sagging downward under layers of dust. But it wasn't the decay that stopped Grace mid-step, it was what remained preserved. On the far wall, illuminated by the narrow beam of her flashlight, hung a large drawing in a warped wooden frame. The picture had been hung upside down, the nail barely gripping what was left of the rotted panel. Grace slowly approached it and turned her head to study the image, a young girl with curly hair standing in a field, one hand holding a stuffed animal, the other reaching toward a black dog sitting nearby. Above them, scrawled in childish handwriting with smeared crayon, were 3 words: "I miss Mom." Max let out a faint whine. Grace's breath fogged in the cold air. She carefully took down the frame and flipped it right side up. At the bottom corner of the image, nearly hidden in the folds of brown crayon, was a faded series of letters: Project Lyra, Phase 3. She turned toward one of the filing cabinets and tugged on the handle. It stuck, then gave way with a rusty groan. Inside were folders, some marked only with numbers, others labeled with names or initials. The largest binder at the back bore the project name Lyra. Phase 3 memory activation via artistic trigger. "Trigger," she muttered, flipping the cover open. The pages inside were typewritten, interspersed with handwritten notes. Grace skimmed through the preface. Phase 3 objectives: elicit suppressed memory retrieval through multisensory art exposure. Subjects: children ages 5 to 9. Secondary reinforcement via visual repetition. Animal bond stimuli, sound association. Grace flipped farther, skimming faster now. Case file 14B. Subject reported recurring nightmares after repeated exposure to dog imagery paired with maternal absence. Notable increase in emotional recall after exposure to hand-drawn scene featuring childhood pet. Grace lowered the binder, her fingers trembling slightly. Max sat silently by the doorway, his body still tail-twitching just once. Just then behind her she heard a faint shuffle and turned quickly. Standing at the entrance of the corridor was an elderly woman in a quilted burgundy sweater and orthopedic shoes. Alma Gates, a long-term patient at St. Elora. Alma was in her mid-80s, her frame small and delicate, her white hair always tied neatly into a bun. She suffered from advanced dementia, and rarely spoke in full sentences, often wandering the halls murmuring nursery rhymes or humming lullabies to no one in particular. Now, however, Alma stood unusually still. Her cloudy gray eyes were fixed on the drawing Grace still held. "That's Finn," she whispered. Grace blinked. "What?" Alma stepped slowly forward, her voice shaking. "Finn, the black one." He waited outside the green room. "Always." Grace set the picture down gently on a desk and approached Alma. "Do you remember this room?" Alma nodded once. "They brought us down here when we cried too much. Said it was art therapy, but the colors made us sadder. One day they gave me a red crayon and asked me to draw my mom. I don't remember if I ever did." Her eyes filled with tears, but Finn always remembered. Grace knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on Alma's. "Who was Finn?" "A dog," Alma said simply. "Mine. Maybe. All of ours." Behind them, Max approached slowly. Alma turned her gaze to him and smiled faintly. "Not him, but he's close." She gently patted Max's head. "He smells like the past." Hal's voice echoed faintly down the corridor behind them. "Grace, what the hell is going on? You disappeared." Grace stood as Hal appeared in the doorway holding a flashlight and blinking into the gloom. "You brought Alma down here?" he asked, surprised. "She followed me," Grace said. She recognized the drawing. Called the dog Finn, and she remembered this room, what they did here. Hal looked at Alma with a new kind of wariness. "That's not possible." Alma's file said she was admitted here in 1989, long after the Lyra wing was shut down. Alma chuckled. "Files lie." Hal frowned. "That dog Finn, he's referenced in some old records, but no photos, no confirmation. I always assumed he was a therapy animal from the earlier phases." "Or maybe more," Grace said. "They mentioned using animals for reinforcement. What if Finn was part of the triggers? What if the dog was the memory tether?" Hal rubbed the back of his neck. If so, they weren't studying trauma, they were engineering it. Grace looked around the room again. The folders, the mold, the drawing. The weight of memory hung heavy in the air, and the silence that followed felt like it had been waiting decades to fall. Max let out another quiet whine and placed a paw on the cabinet drawer beneath the table where the drawing had sat. Grace bent down and pulled it open. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was a single worn collar. The tag had been scrubbed clean, but faint etching remained FN4. She turned to Hal. "This is bigger than one forgotten room." He nodded slowly. "And we've just opened it." The fluorescent lights in St. Alora's East Wing flickered weakly as Grace walked down the corridor with Max by her side. The staff had cleared the lower section of the building earlier that morning under the pretense of a minor electrical fault, but the truth was far stranger. The documents she had scanned from the Lyra Phase 3 folder were now stored on a secure USB drive, encrypted and sent directly to the FBI's Digital Forensics Division. Less than 24 hours later, she'd received a curt message from a man who introduced himself only as Agent Cole, mid-40s, military buzz-cut, clean-shaven, monotone voice. He wore a plain gray suit, no badge, and didn't offer a card. His instructions were simple. "Don't speak to the press. Don't remove anything further. We'll handle it." But Grace wasn't done, and neither was Max. She hadn't told them about the rest, the framed drawing, the collar, or Alma's reaction. She kept those details tucked safely in her notebook and deeper still in her gut, guided more by instinct than training. Max had been quiet all morning, but as they re-entered the hidden room, his ears pricked. His tail stiffened as he turned away from the shelving and walked slowly toward the west wall, the one partially covered in peeling acoustic foam. He sniffed at the lower edge, pawed gently, then looked at her with something close to insistence. Grace knelt beside him, running her fingers over the wall. Her knuckles tapped something hollow. She stood, retrieved a flathead screwdriver from her pocket, and wedged it between two panels. The foam tore away in chunks, revealing a square panel with a faded bronze dial, the edge of an old wall safe embedded into the concrete. The dial was worn, but intact. Grace stared at it, heart thudding. "Really?" she whispered. "You're a bloodhound now." Max gave a short, proud huff and sat back. Grace turned the dial first experimentally, then with more pressure. To her surprise, it clicked into place after only a few turns. The latch gave with a metallic groan and the door creaked open. Inside, beneath a thick dust cover, sat a plastic cassette case, its label handwritten in faded red marker. Session 9. Subject MG. She gently lifted it out. The case was old but intact, the tape inside still spooled tight. Taped to the back was a folded note. She peeled it off and opened it. The handwriting was slanted, hesitant, like a child copying someone else's letters. The words read, "Don't forget, you promised to remember." Her chest tightened. She recognized the curves of the G, the looping M. It was her own childhood handwriting. She knew it without question. Her knees felt weak as she leaned against the desk. "It's me," she whispered. Max nosed the tape gently. Grace took a steadying breath, then pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she hadn't used in over a year. Daniel Reyes, her old college friend, now a local audio technician and sound archivist for Belmere's Historical Society. Daniel had always been eccentric, tall, lean, always wearing vintage band t-shirts, usually with coffee stains, and famous for his obsession with analog audio. He once rebuilt a 1950s tube amplifier using nothing but thrift shop parts and a soldering iron. He picked up after 2 rings. "Grace, wow, you finally remembered I exist. I need your help," she said. "Now, do you still have your reel-to-reel and cassette converters?" "Do squirrels hoard acorns?" Daniel replied. "What are we playing, Elvis bootlegs? Secret Confessions?" Grace hesitated. "Something older. Classified, probably." There was a pause, then Daniel exhaled. "You had me at classified. Meet you at the workshop, 15 minutes. She hung up and slid the tape into her bag. As she left the hidden room, Max at her heel, she looked over her shoulder one last time. The fan still hung motionless above. The child's drawing leaned against the desk. The room was silent again, but something about it felt watchful, like it had released just one fragment of a truth that wasn't finished yet. Daniel's workshop was in a converted garage behind his parents' old Victorian on Maple Street. The inside smelled like solder and pine wood, cluttered with open audio boards, vinyl sleeves, and vacuum tubes. A shaggy golden retriever named Otis snored under a desk. Daniel greeted them in socks and pajama pants, motioning toward a desk already set up with a cassette deck. "Hand it over Agent Grace." She passed him the tape, trying not to look too anxious. He slipped it into the deck hit play and adjusted the levels. Static hissed. Then a voice, a little girl's, filled the room. The voice was soft, trembling. "I don't want to forget anymore." Another pause. "Please. Let me remember. I'll be good. I won't scream again. I promise." Daniel froze. The tape clicked as it looped. It had only those few sentences repeated again, each time, with the same mixture of fear and pleading. Grace pressed a hand over her mouth. Max let out a low whine. Daniel turned slowly in his chair. "Grace, MG." She nodded. "Oh my God, that's you." "I think so," she whispered. "Why would you be saying those things? I think I was one of them. One of the children in Lyra." Daniel blinked, speechless. Otis stirred but didn't rise. Grace stared at the tape deck as the loop repeated, mechanical and haunting. She remembered nothing of saying those words, and yet hearing them felt like touching something hot, instinctual, ancient. Max moved forward and pressed his head against her thigh. "I don't want to forget anymore," the voice repeated. Grace whispered, "Neither do I." The rain had returned by morning, drumming softly against the high windows of St. Elora like a quiet warning. The hospital hallways were emptier than usual. Staff were rotated to other wings under vague maintenance notices, and the east wing, where Grace and Hal now stood, was completely cleared. The silence added weight to every breath. Grace glanced down at Max. The German shepherd had been unusually tense since the night before, sticking to her like a shadow. He hadn't barked or growled once, but his eyes, those steady gold-flecked eyes, never stopped scanning. They were back in room 3B, not far from where they'd found the steel door. This time, Grace focused on a different spot, the corner near the radiator where Max had earlier scratched at the tile as if something underneath disturbed him. Grace knelt and brushed away the accumulated dust. The tile felt uneven. She tapped once, hollow. Again, thunk. A sound that didn't belong. Hal stood nearby, cane in one hand, the other gripping a flashlight. His face was drawn today more so than usual, his eyes shadowed under thick brows. He hadn't slept well, and the lines around his mouth showed it. "Tell me you're not about to rip a hole in the floor," he muttered. "Just a loose tile," Grace replied, prying up the edge with a slim crowbar. It came free with a snap, revealing a square of tarnished brass set into the concrete, an old floor hatch, the kind used for maintenance decades ago. Hal leaned closer. "That's not on any blueprint I've seen." Grace looked at Max. The dog gave one sharp breath and sat tail stiff behind him. That was all the confirmation she needed. She pulled the hatch open. It revealed a narrow metal stairwell, steep and coated with grime. Cold air rushed upward, damp and tinged with iron. "Ready?" she asked. Hal sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'm too old for this." But they descended. The stairs creaked as they moved downward, Max leading with cautious steps. At the bottom was a heavy metal door, slightly ajar. Grace pushed it open into darkness. Her flashlight beam swept across the space, rough concrete floors, high ceilings, and strange fixtures along the walls. They had entered a room that was part laboratory, part observation chamber. Against the far wall stood an oversized two-way mirror cracked in one corner, the kind used in psychological testing. To its left was a reclining medical chair, its faux leather cushions torn, one armrest stained with something long since dried. Next to it stood a control console built into the wall with dusty speakers and a row of analog dials. One was still labeled in marker Freck, E1. Max approached the chair and sniffed. Then he growled low and steady. "Doesn't feel like therapy down here," Hal muttered, running a finger along the edge of the broken mirror. "Looks like someone tried to bury it and forgot the body." Grace stepped towards the console. She turned a dial. The old speakers whined to life with a faint hiss of static. Then a low rhythmic tone played a vibrating hum like a music note slowed and warped until it made your teeth buzz. She switched it off quickly, stomach twisting. Hal sat on a stool by the console. "You ever read about low-frequency sound manipulation? They said it could stimulate fear, sadness, even panic. The military tried it once for crowd control. Never worked right. Left more people confused than afraid. But kids?" He trailed off. Grace opened a drawer beneath the console. Inside was a series of folders, and beneath them a small velvet pouch. She opened it, breath-catching. Inside was a silver chain with a brass tag, MG, 1979. She held it like something sacred. "This belonged to me," she whispered. "I had a necklace like this when I was 6. My adoptive parents said I lost it on a camping trip." Hal looked up. "Margaret Grace." She nodded slowly. "Margaret Grace Lyman. That was my full name before I was adopted. My file said I was orphaned in 79. He exhaled. "They didn't just erase memories. They erased identities." Grace reached for another folder, opening it to find a series of photos, children sitting in the chair they now stood beside. All of them had blank expressions. Some were crying. Some were drawing. All were flanked by black dogs. She flipped to the last page. A photo of a girl, curly auburn hair, head tilted toward the mirror, hand resting on a black-furred German shepherd's back. Below it, subject MG, Session 12. Grace stared. Max stood beside her now. His breath was warm against her hand, his eyes fixed on hers. Slowly she knelt, placed the necklace around her neck, and whispered, "You were always there, weren't you?" Max didn't move, but something in his stillness felt like a nod. Hal looked toward the mirror again. "We need to bring this to the FBI. Now." Grace shook her head. "Not yet. There's more here. I can feel it." She turned back toward the room flashlight, passing over faded charts, decayed tapes, and finally on the wall near the chair, a series of markings. Small tick marks carved into the paint, 37 in total, ending just above a final line scratched in deeper than the rest. A child had been counting. Grace's voice caught in her throat. This wasn't observation. This was imprisonment. The mirror reflected their figures now, hers standing tall but trembling. Hal seated with weary resignation, and Max seated squarely between them like a sentinel. The air seemed to hum again, not with sound but memory. Whatever had happened down here hadn't been forgotten. It had only been waiting. The gray light of early morning spilled through the stained glass above the entrance of St. Elora like water through cracked marble. Grace sat alone in the staff break room, a thick file spread open in front of her on the table. The pages trembled slightly in her hands, not from the drafty window behind her, but from the adrenaline that hadn't yet settled since the night before. Hal had called her just after sunrise. "There's something in the mailroom," he'd said. "A package, unmarked, no return address. But I think you'll want to see it." Now, hours later, she was staring at the contents, a Department of Defense briefing report declassified through quiet, obscure channels. It was dated 1982, top corner stamped in red, Project Lyra, sub 09 analysis, internal use only. She flipped past the executive summary and focused on the central paragraph. Subject 09, Margaret Grace Lyman status. Active participant, cognitive potential classified as resonant. Memory retention higher than standard metrics. Initial suppression via audio-visual stimuli unsuccessful. Emotional tether detected. Recommend pairing with animal companion imprint to stabilize and redirect associative trauma. Canine designation. Max. Imprint approved. Purpose memory anchor reinforcement and containment. Grace felt her stomach tighten. Max, lying beneath the table, shifted his head slightly. He was 9 years old now, his fur peppered with gray around the jowls and the edges of his paws. His chest rose and fell slowly, his ears flicking as if reacting to a sound only he could hear. And yet, as she looked at him, something clicked into place. He wasn't just a retired K-9. He had been hers all along. She didn't remember him from childhood, not clearly. Just hazy dreams of warm fur and barking in the dark. But here it was, in black and white. Max had been chosen, trained, and bonded with her not to comfort, but to contain, to suppress. The door creaked, and Hal entered his long coat, soaked from the rain outside. He looked more composed than he had in days, though the deep creases under his eyes remained. "You saw it?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Subject 09. That's me." He walked over and set a cardboard evidence box on the table beside the file. This came from the sub-level room, one of the drawers you didn't check. Maintenance found it when they started cataloging the space. Grace opened the box and pulled out a wrapped canvas the size of a school project. As she peeled away the paper, she froze. It was a child's painting, faded and done in thick crayon and watercolors. In the center, a young girl with auburn curls stood between two dogs, one sleek and black with icy blue eyes, the other golden brown with soft, floppy ears. A shaky heart had been drawn around the three figures, and beneath it, in jagged purple strokes, "I love them both." Max stood now, tail wagging once. His eyes met Grace's, and for a split second, something ancient passed between them. Not memory, but recognition. "I remember this," she whispered. "Not the moment, just the feeling." Hal pulled out the second sheet that had been folded in with the canvas, a short memo. "Child exhibits unusual resilience to both memory suppression and emotional control. Heart association symbol may indicate resistance. Remove one anchor. Finn, reinforce Max as sole tether." Grace's hand trembled. "They separated me from Finn," she said. "They made Max stay so I wouldn't remember, but it didn't work. Not entirely." Hal rested a hand on her shoulder. "You've always had pieces. That's why you drew dogs in college, why you couldn't stand mirrors. It's not random." Grace leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe. "So Max wasn't just some rescue. He was returned to me on purpose or by accident, and something in him remembered. That's why he found the cabinet. The door. The safe. Hal nodded. They trained him to follow you. He's always been following. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the rain tapping against the glass. Then Grace reached down and touched Max's collar. You stayed, she said softly. Even after they took everything else, you stayed. Max pressed his head into her knee. She folded the painting carefully and set it back into the box, her fingers resting on the crayon heart for just a moment longer than necessary. What do I do with this? She asked aloud. Hal's answer came without hesitation. You show it to the world. Because they tried to bury a child's voice under concrete and silence. And now that voice is finally speaking. The east wing of St. Elora had never looked like this before. Sunlight poured through the newly installed skylights, casting warm gold across walls that once held whispers and shadows. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust replaced the mildew and metal that had lingered for decades. The room where Grace had first heard her childhood voice through an old cassette now echoed with the soft laughter of children dipping brushes into watercolors. Max sat quietly in the center of it all, a dark gold statue of patience. His muzzle had grown whiter over the last few months, but his posture was proud. A navy blue ribbon with a silver badge rested on his collar. National Memory Sentinel, the plaque had read when presented by a soft-spoken FBI liaison named Agent Norris, who had tears in his eyes as he knelt to pin it on. The badge had come after the story broke K9 Exposes hidden trauma experiment from Cold War era. The room had been rebuilt under FBI oversight and grant funding from the Department of Veterans Affairs and several mental health nonprofits. It was no longer just a relic of Lyra, it was a space reclaimed. Called the Center for Reflective Healing, it served as both a memorial and a place of recovery for trauma-affected youth. In the far corner stood a framed photo of Max taken the day of the dedication. Behind him, sunlight cut through stained glass, casting rainbow fragments onto the floor where he stood beside Grace. Now Grace stood at the wall of children's artwork, carefully adjusting a new addition. A crayon sketch of a girl holding hands with a dog, both looking up at a door labeled Hope. She no longer wore her nursing badge. She wore loose paint-streaked overalls and soft cotton shirts, her hair often braided down her back. Teaching had shifted her posture, her voice. There was more peace in her now, not because the past didn't hurt, but because it had a place to live. As she stepped back, someone called her name. Grace. She turned. A woman, late 70s, stood near the main entrance. Her posture was elegant despite age, with silver hair pinned neatly and a linen shawl draped over her shoulders. She held a brown envelope yellowed at the corners. Her eyes were pale blue, but there was a searching weight behind them, like someone who'd waited a long time to speak. "I'm sorry," the woman said softly. "I didn't want to interrupt." "You're not," Grace replied. "Can I help you?" The woman approached, extending the envelope with both hands. Her fingers trembled slightly. "This is for you," she said. "It's from someone who once made terrible mistakes." Grace hesitated, then gently took the envelope. Across the front was written in cursive, "For Maggie when you are strong enough to remember." Her breath caught. "Maggie," she whispered. The woman nodded. "I worked here a long time ago. I was a nurse. I was told not to ask questions." "But I should have. I should have fought for you." Grace looked at the woman carefully. There was something familiar in the cheekbones, in the way her voice softened at the edges. "Are you my mother?" she asked. The woman's lips quivered, but she nodded once. "Yes. I tried to find you after the project was shut down. But they told me you'd been relocated, that your memory was reset, that I should forget." Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a 2-page letter written in a hand so similar to her own, it felt like déjà vu. The words were imperfect, scratched out in places, but raw Maggie. They told me I couldn't keep you safe and be loyal to my country. I chose wrong. I chose silence. I should have torn down the walls, screamed your name, burned the place to the ground if they wouldn't give you back. But I didn't. I went along. I folded sheets. I smiled in meetings, and I let them take you. But I never stopped painting, never stopped writing, and I never stopped remembering you. I hope one day you'd remember me too. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am here now because you remembered even when they told you to forget. Love always, your mother Ruth. Grace pressed the paper to her chest. For a moment the silence between them was thick. Then she reached out and pulled Ruth into an embrace slowly, carefully, like they were learning how to exist in the same shape again. Behind them, Max rose and padded toward them. He sat beside them quietly, as if sealing a circle long left broken. That afternoon, Grace added a new canvas to the gallery wall. It was simple. 2 dogs, one black, one gold, curled at the feet of a small girl with auburn curls. The girl was painting the sun. Behind her was a door with light spilling from the cracks. The plaque beneath it read, "When memory returns, so does light." Sometimes what the world calls forgotten is only waiting for the right moment to be remembered. In Grace's journey, we saw that memory, though buried by fear. Silence and time can still rise when touched by love, loyalty, and something greater than ourselves. Max was more than a dog. He was a guardian, a bridge between what was broken and what was meant to be whole. And maybe, just maybe, he was a miracle in fur, a quiet answer from God to a prayer once whispered by a child who didn't want to forget. This story reminds us that healing is possible, that the light can return even after years of darkness. Sometimes God sends his answers not through thunder or fire, but through a bark, a brushstroke, or a gentle nudge from an old friend with 4 paws and a silent memory. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs hope, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to our channel to help bring more stories of healing and truth into the light. And if you believe that love, memory, and faith are never truly lost, just waiting to be found, type Amen in the comments. And may God bless you and everyone you hold dear.